The world thinks this story is about Venezuela, about Nicolás Maduro, a sudden U.S. raid, and a familiar display of American power. But if you're sitting in the Kremlin, this is not a Latin American crisis. It's a warning signal. When U.S. forces seized Maduro and his wife, Moscow immediately began weighing wins and losses. Diplomatic hypocrisy, NATO divisions, spheres of influence, all the usual chess pieces. Yet for Vladimir Putin, none of that is decisive. His real anxiety lies elsewhere. In oil markets already turning soft, in tankers that sail without flags, in a war in Ukraine that depends quietly but completely on energy revenue and logistical shadows. This is the moment where a regional intervention brushes up against the core of Russian power, not through missiles, but through prices, shipping lanes, and pressure that hasn't fully arrived yet. If you want to understand what Putin is truly watching right now, stay with me. Because the obvious story isn't the important one, and what comes next may reshape far more than Venezuela. The question then is what this intervention actually represents. Strip away the headlines, and the Caracas operation is not about regime change in Venezuela alone. It is about leverage, about how power is exercised indirectly in a world where direct confrontation is costly and unpredictable. For Moscow, Venezuela has never been a strategic prize. It has been a node, a place where oil flows, arms contracts exist on paper, and political symbolism outweighs economic reality. Losing that node is inconvenient, but survivable. What matters more is the pattern. A U.S. willingness to act militarily, a renewed assertion of spheres of influence, and an ambiguous signal about how far Washington is prepared to go when norms collide with interests. Russian policymakers are trained to think systemically. They ask not what did the U.S. do, but what behavior does this normalize? If sovereignty can be overridden in Caracas, arguments can be recycled elsewhere by anyone. This is where short-term optics give way to long-term structure, and where Venezuela becomes less a country than a precedent. In the next step, we need to understand how Moscow arrived at this calculation, and why history has trained it to fear pressure that starts small. To understand that fear, you have to look backward. Russia's relationship with Venezuela was built over decades, not out of ideology, but out of cycles. When Moscow was pushed to the margins of the Western-led system, it looked for partners equally isolated. Energy, arms, and symbolism fill the gaps that trust and capital could not. Venezuela fit perfectly. Oil reserves without access, a government in need of patrons, and a stage far from Europe where Russia could project relevance at low cost. Over 20 years, investments accumulated, loans were extended, weapons were sold. None of it was especially profitable, but it was strategically useful until the global cycle shifted. Sanctions hardened, energy markets softened, and the war in Ukraine made oil revenue not just important but existential. What once looked like diversification now looks like exposure. History teaches Russian planners a brutal lesson: pressure rarely arrives all at once. It escalates through mechanisms, markets, logistics, norms, before it becomes overt. Venezuela, seen through this lens, is not an endpoint. It is an early chapter, and the first cracks are already visible. Then came the shock, not a declaration, not a doctrine, but an action. The U.S. seizure of Nicolás Maduro was a sudden escalation that broke a long-standing pattern. Washington had pressured, sanctioned, isolated, but it had rarely crossed this line. Now it had. For Moscow, this was a mini-crisis, not because Maduro mattered, but because the rules suddenly looked thinner. Russian commentators rushed to find upside. They spoke of hypocrisy exposed, of America violating sovereignty, of Moscow stepping awkwardly but confidently into the language of international law. Even the idea of spheres of influence once condemned now seemed tacitly endorsed. But beneath that rhetoric sat a colder realization. If Venezuela could be touched, Russian assets could be too. investments written off, arms contracts mocked, trade routes disrupted. And unlike diplomacy, these losses could be counted. This is how strategic anxiety begins, not with panic, but with accounting, with the quiet recognition that symbolic gains do not pay for wars, subsidies, or stability. If this analysis is helping you see the system behind the headlines, stay engaged. These dynamics matter, because the deeper mechanism driving this crisis has not yet revealed itself. What really matters is the machinery beneath the surface. Power today is exercised less through conquest than through systems. Energy markets, shipping insurance, financial compliance, norm enforcement that looks technical but isn't. Russia's oil exports no longer move like they used to. They travel through a vast improvised network, often described as a shadow fleet, aging tankers, murky ownership, jurisdictions that look the other way. It is not elegant, but it works, so long as pressure remains selective. Venezuela suddenly threatens that assumption. U.S. action there introduces a dangerous ambiguity. If Washington is willing to seize assets, board ships, or run an oil-producing state, the boundary between sanctions and enforcement begins to blur. What was once tolerated becomes targetable. For Putin, this is the hidden mechanism of risk, not rhetoric, not diplomacy, but the possibility that logistical gray zones turn black overnight. Oil priced at $35 a barrel is not a statistic. It is a constraint. Every further decline tightens the system. This is how pressure scales quietly, structurally, and once it starts, it is very hard to stop. The second surge comes without warning, not from Caracas but from the sea. Russian policymakers are watching tankers as closely as battle maps. Because the Venezuela operation hints at something larger, a shift from symbolic enforcement to physical interruption. If ships moving Russian oil near Venezuela can be stopped, questioned, seized, then the shadow fleet stops being invisible. That is the mini-crisis. Until now, Washington has largely tolerated this gray network. It sanctioned, but it did not hunt. It condemned, but it did not intercept. Venezuela changes the psychology. It tests whether tolerance has expired, and once one interdiction happens, the system reacts fast. Insurance premiums spike, ports hesitate, buyers demand deeper discounts. The result is not collapse, but suffocation. This is why the Kremlin reads Venezuela alongside Ukraine. The two theaters are not connected geographically, but they are linked economically. Energy revenue funds endurance. Logistics sustain war. A squeeze at sea can echo on the battlefield. That is the second peak of tension. And it pushes the question inward, toward the people who ultimately absorb the cost. And this is where the story reaches you. Because systems do not absorb pressure. People do. If oil revenues fall further, the adjustment does not happen in ministries or speeches. It happens in budgets, in wages that stop rising, in social promises quietly revised, in regions far from Moscow that feel the squeeze first. You may never hear the words Venezuela or shadow fleet spoken aloud, but you will feel their consequences through inflation that lingers, through a certainty that hardens, through a state that asks for patience while preparing for endurance. For ordinary Russians, the war in Ukraine already carries a cost. Energy money has softened it, masked it, delayed the reckoning. A sustained drop in prices removes that cushion. This is why Putin worries, not about prestige, but about pressure leaking downward. If you want to understand geopolitics, don't just watch leaders. Watch who is asked to adapt, because once these forces ripple outward, they reshape the global balance. The impact does not stop inside Russia. Energy markets are global, and pressure never travels in straight lines. A disruption tied to Venezuela reverberates across alliances, rivals, and regions already stretched thin. If Russian oil is forced deeper into discounts, buyers recalibrate. Some hesitate, others demand more leverage. Supply chains shift, and countries that depend on cheap energy quietly, pragmatically, are pulled into uncomfortable choices. At the same time, the political signal matters. Trump's action has unsettled allies as much as adversaries. NATO unity, briefly strained by talk of spheres of influence, now faces a test of cohesion. Will pressure on shipping harden into a broader Western consensus or fracture under economic strain? For Moscow, this is the nightmare scenario. Not isolation, but coordination. Not sanctions on paper, but alignment in practice. Ukraine sits at the center of this equation. Any reconsolidation of Western resolve, especially one tied to enforcement at sea, raises the cost of prolonging the war. This is how regional moves become global stress tests. And it sets the stage for what comes next. The future is now opening in front of the Kremlin. From here, three futures emerge. The first is the managed outcome. Oil prices soften but not collapse. U.S. pressure remains selective. The shadow fleet survives. Damaged, slower, more expensive but functional. Putin absorbs the hit, adjusts budgets, and continues the war in Ukraine at a lower burn rate. The second is the gray squeeze. Energy prices fall further. A few high-profile tanker seizures occur. Insurance dries up. Discounts deepen. Western coordination around Ukraine stiffens, not dramatically but decisively. Russia does not implode, but the margin for error disappears. The third is the system shock. Washington actively pursues lower oil prices. Enforcement expands. The shadow fleet collapses as a viable workaround. Revenues plunge, domestic pressure rises, and the Ukraine war becomes strategically untenable. None of these scenarios is inevitable, but all are plausible. This is the cruel logic of systems. They don't announce which path you're on until you can no longer change course. And that brings us to the final question. What does this moment actually teach us about power? This is the illusion Venezuela exposes. Power today is no longer measured only in troops or territory, but in control over systems, over prices you don't set, routes you don't fully own, alliances that can harden faster than you expect. Putin understands this. That is why he is not obsessed with Maduro's fate or with diplomatic theatrics. He is watching oil charts, shipping movements, Western tone shifts that hint at something firmer taking shape, because wars are not lost only on battlefields. They are lost when revenue thins, when logistics fail quietly, when endurance becomes arithmetic. For you watching from the outside, this moment matters. It shows how modern power works and how fragile it can be. A raid in Caracas, a tanker at sea, a price tick on a screen. Together they shape outcomes far larger than any headline suggests. If you want to keep seeing the world this way through systems, not slogans, stay with this analysis. Share it, question it, push it further, because the next chapter won't announce itself loudly, and by the time it does, the balance may already have shifted.